another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, further exploring the cultures of consciousness. I still remember, I remember a lot of encounters with books that I've had in my life. I think like a lot of people, they tend to be more clustered in my younger years when there was probably more room for new ideas to come in and remake the place. Luckily, it still happens today, but I very much recall when and where I was, both in my life and physically, when I first read Rupert Sheldrake's New Science of Life, and I think I read it in 1986 when I was an undergraduate, and it blew my mind. And one of the things about this book, which I'll talk about in a second, that I really appreciate is that while it did not convert me one way or the other, it stayed with me my whole life so far, in the sense that I turn to some of its core concepts regularly as the most sensible way of describing phenomena that I am otherwise unwilling to acknowledge in some fundamental scientific way. And what I mean by that is that in that book, Rupert introduces this notion of morphogenetic fields or morphic fields. And the idea is that there's kind of a memory inside spaces and also between spaces that helps things develop, both the development of individual cells, of morphogenesis in organisms, but also in terms of kind of memories in places and the capacity for people to perform tasks that 10 years before were very difficult to perform. So as soon as people start to do it, it sends out a kind of it creates a change in this morphic resonance field that enables people to sort of cue into that easier. It's really the way that habit informs the universe rather than the notion of natural law. I'm afraid I'm kind of mangling it here a bit, and Rupert's probably wincing a bit on the line, but he's a gentleman, so he'll cut me some slack. But in any case, as folks in the show know, I walk a curious middle line between skepticism and open-mindedness, particularly about things that current materialist science poo-poos. And I take those criticisms seriously and to a certain degree, and there's a point at which I fall off and say, hey, something else has to be going on here. And I'm very interested in ideas that kind of gently lead one towards a more expanded view of the universe, of consciousness, of the nature of mind, as well as the nature of what we call matter, which we should always remember is itself a historical construction, this notion of matter, which kind of weirdly combines the physical stuff we encounter in our everyday world with some abstract mathematical scientific concept of what matter is. So it's already a tricky term. But many times in my life when I've tried to understand what could ghosts be, what is it about certain places that seem to carry some trace of the past, or what is it about how certain ideas pass or certain practices we seem to work easier within different contexts. And the notion of morphic resonance has really stayed with me, partly because I love resonance. It's a great concept. Everything resonates. It's the secret history of the world, resonance. So I was very happy to meet Rupert earlier this year, finally, after many near misses and some friends in common. We got to hang out and had a delightful time when I was visiting the UK, and he agreed to come on the podcast and talk about, we can talk about probably a little bit his last book, The Science Delusion, which came out a couple of years ago. Probably some of you have read, and it gave me the opportunity to read through it more thoroughly than I had before, and I quite enjoyed the ride, but I'm sure we'll wander into other topics. So with no further ado, Rupert, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Good to be with you, Erik.
Wonderful. Yes, I really enjoyed reading the book after we had met, because I could sort of hear your voice in in a lot of the writing, and particularly, when we were talking before, we talked a lot about skeptics, militant atheists, the kind of organized, passionate, militant kinds of practices that many people do in order to kind of corral folks in terms of what's appropriate thinking, what's inappropriate thinking, what counts as science, who should be mocked, et cetera, et cetera. And I was struck as we talked about this issue, which really has quite a significant impact in the world, or at least my world, our world, that you brought a great deal of patience and kind of gentlemanly quality to issues that often drive people really batty and get people really riled up and angry and vociferous, and you bring that same elegance and care to many of your arguments in the science delusion when you're taking on some of the fundamental axioms of contemporary materialism or physicalism, and when you're addressing some of the kinds of critics who are often so snide and so there's a kind of nastiness that's inherent in the not inherent, but is often found in the skeptical mode. So it was really wonderful to read it with your voice, or your voice in mind. But I wanted to start out talking a little bit about the morphic fields, the morphogenetic fields. I did feel like I didn't quite do I didn't quite do the best service to the concept initially. So please feel free to phrase it a little bit more elegantly than I did. But I'm also really curious about the origins of the concept. What was happening in your life? What was going on? What were you thinking about? What were you studying? Where this sort of notion emerged, and did it emerge slowly over time, or did it kind of pop up with a kind of eureka quality?
Well, there was a eureka quality. This happened a long, long time ago, 1973. I was a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. I had a laboratory. I was doing research in developmental biology, working on plants. And I'd made some discoveries about plant growth that I found very exciting. I'd discovered that the hormone auxin, AUXIN, which is one of the major plant hormones, is made by dying cells within plants. A lot of cells die within plants, including the wood cells, which become dead, empty tubes to conduct water. But I'd found out how it was made, and then I worked out how it was transported around the plants, the mechanism of polar auxin transport. It's transported from the root tips towards the shoot tips. All this was a major advance in developmental biology. And, I was very excited about these discoveries. I was working within the mechanistic framework and so on. And then when I reflected on them, I realized that all plants have the same auxin. They all have the same polar transport system within the same plant. The leaves and the flowers and the roots all have these same systems. And yet the leaves look different from the flowers, and the leaves of oak trees look different from the leaves of ash trees or palm trees. In a way, this explained too much. It didn't explain why things were different. And so I got interested in the concept of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, which was not my idea. It had been part of developmental biology since the 1920s. And I thought this was the best way to go. Just like there's a kind of invisible field around a magnet that shapes where the iron filings go, so the idea was there's a kind of invisible mold or pattern or form around a developing shoot or around a developing embryo that shapes what happens. So, as I say, I read up this idea. It was a kind of minority idea within animal and plant developmental biology. But the problem was to understand how these fields could be inherited, because they weren't in the genes, and the only thing people at the time thought could be inherited were the genes. So there was a kind of problem. How could these fields be inherited, because they clearly were inherited, and yet not in genes? At this stage, I was reading a book by the great French philosopher Henri Bergson about the nature of memory, and he had... this was written around 1900. he had the idea that memories are not stored in the brain. There's a kind of influence directly across time involved in human memory. I realized that if there was an influence across time, directly across time, connecting things on the basis of similarity, the inheritance of morphogenetic fields could be explained in a completely different way. When this occurred to me, I was in a state of kind of eureka excitement for several days. I mean, I was in a kind of hyper state of extraordinary excitement because, as I thought about it, more and more phenomena seemed to fit in. Memory, inheritance of form, inheritance of instincts, and in its most general sense, the so-called laws of nature could be seen as more like habits. So I was very, very excited by this. It was a eureka experience. I was soon brought down to earth when I discussed it with colleagues in the biochemistry department where I was working, and I found that they were very unexcited about it. In fact, they thought it was crazy. So I realized that if I was going to develop this idea, it would take a long time, and I'd have to be very sure of my ground. I didn't really write about it until I started writing about it in 1979. My first book was published in 1981, so that was, quite a while after I first had the idea, because I wanted to be quite sure about it before I wrote about it.
One of the things that struck me about it at the time and continues to strike is this notion of resonance. It always seemed to me that resonance as a physical phenomenon, as an acoustic phenomenon, as a metaphor, as an analogy, as a kind of general system concept. How do systems behave? In certain circumstances, different systems begin to resonate. It's a very, very powerful idea and a really interesting one to track between, the physical phenomenon of resonant frequency in a room to the way in which New Age people talk about resonance as a way to describe these nebulous energy fields in their bodies or in their experience that are hard to capture in other ways, to a kind of rigorous idea about how different things could associate with one another or through time or through space, this kind of sense of if things are similar enough, then the energy of one can be passed to the energy of the other, or variations of that theme. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that the term resonance, how it inspired you, how you came to choose that as part of the mechanism of what you were talking about.
Well, I was looking for a way of understanding how things that were similar could influence each other across space and time. Because morphic resonance the idea that I was trying to, as the first few days of this idea, of this connection across time, I hadn't yet got the term resonance, but I had got the idea of similarity. That something had to work automatically on the basis of similarity. And everything in living organisms is moving, it's changing, it's rhythmic. There's nothing static, even in molecules and atoms. According to quantum theory, there are electrons whizzing around in orbitals. The nucleus is vibrating all the time. Everything's vibrating in nature, not just in life. So similar vibratory patterns of activity being connected across space and time, what word could emphasize the similarity and the vibratory nature? And really, there was only one word that would do the trick, and that was resonance. Because resonance happens automatically when you have acoustic resonance. If you put your foot on the loud pedal of a piano and you chant, ooh, the piano will come back with the sound ooh, and if you chant ah, it'll come back with ah, because you're setting up a different pattern of resonance, different overtones according to different vowels. It's working on a similarity basis, and of course radio waves, tuning a radio to a frequency, is based on resonance as well. Those are both energetic resonances. They involve a transfer of energy. What I was proposing was something rather different. It was more a transfer of information than of energy, but resonance still seemed the best word for describing this. And what I was talking about was the way things are organized, the pattern, the form, the structure. And so the word morphic, which means form or shape, from the Greek word morphe, form or shape, seemed the best word for this process. So it took me several days to come up with this, but it came quite quickly, and then it just seemed to me this was the best term to explain it. So I've had that almost from the very beginning of this insight into how things might be.
So I'm curious, as you're the first to admit, exactly how morphic fields work in a way that would be understandable or acceptable to biologists, physicists, etc., remains elusive. That the mechanism exactly of how this would work is you have some suggestions, and we could talk about those. And I'm curious how that feels to be working with a concept that has been with you for so long, and that certainly some people like and other people dismiss, and that has stayed with you, that you're still very convinced of in a certain way, and yet it remains elusive in the terms in which you yourself were trained, in terms of if not a mechanistic account, then at least a sort of general explanatory account that works with our given sort of scientific knowledge, to sort of use a overly general term. So how is that? How's that for you in terms of, is there a frustration there? Does your confidence waver? Are you excited about some new possibilities of how these things might be explained?
Well, I studied history of science when I was at Harvard, between my undergraduate education at Cambridge and doing my PhD there. And I tend to see things through the lens of history of science. And when I looked at the history of the field concept of electromagnetic resonance and electromagnetic radiation, what struck me there was that when Faraday first put forward the idea of electromagnetic fields, electrical and magnetic fields, he didn't know what they were. He thought that they could either be modifications of mere space, as he put it, or vibratory patterns in a subtle matter, the ether. He just didn't know. Then Maxwell came along, and 20 years later, and put forward his electromagnetic field equations, where he worked in terms of the ether, subtle matter, vibrating, as the medium of light transmission. And then in 1905, Einstein came along and said, well, there isn't such a thing as the ether. We've just got fields, just patterns in space and time. And then people said, well, what are they made of? So Einstein spent much of his life looking for a unified field theory to explain these in terms of some more fundamental field. Currently, superstring theory tries to explain them in terms of some 10-dimensional, more fundamental field, but it's not clear whether that's the right approach or not. So even if we take a very well-known phenomenon, electromagnetic radiation and electromagnetic fields, we find that the theoretical explanations of them have changed over the years, and there's no definitive explanation even today. And the same is true of the gravitational field. Einstein described it in his general theory of relativity, but no one knows how it's related to the other fields of nature. So what I concentrated on really in my research was the phenomena. Does morphic resonance really happen? Is there a kind of memory in nature? And I still do concentrate on that angle. And the question of how they might be explained in terms of physics, I rather leave that aside. There's various possible models. I was very friendly with the physicist David Bohm, and he loved the idea of morphic resonance, and he thought it fitted in with his interpretation of quantum theory in terms of the implicate order. Then other people think it might fit in with versions of superstring or M theory. Various people suggest it might depend on sort of connections through wormholes. All of these proposals involve modifications of physics. They usually involve pages and pages of equations, which I don't understand. These are various people have proposed mechanisms for morphic resonance. And I've no idea whether any of them are correct or not. And even if one of them turns out to be the best model in 20 or 30 years' time, it may be some other model would displace it. So I'm not too worried about the mechanism because, as I say, we don't really know the mechanism of gravitation or electromagnetism.
Wonderful. You know, what I really love about your response is it really demonstrates one of the ideas I walked away with from reading The Science Delusion. I think it's a very, very important idea for people to keep in mind all the time when they're thinking about science and power and who gets to say what, is that there really isn't science as such. There are sciences that different people practice in different disciplines with different kinds of methods, different sorts of techniques, looking at different kinds of objects, and that there's really a tremendous diversity between these things, and that they are only unified in some kind of scientific worldview through a process of abstraction, a political process of power, and that if you look at it at the ground, what you find is scientists talking to other scientists in other zones using different languages that are not mutually comprehensible, and everybody is in that situation. Absolutely everybody is in that situation. And when people try to pretend that they can speak for science, they're almost always pulling a sort of rhetorical move or a power move.
Yes, exactly. Can just 1 second, please? Can I just be back with you in 1 second?
Absolutely. I love these kinds of interruptions. I'm also really interested in how mathematics shapes our understanding of physics and the physical reality. You know, all those crazy string theory, 10th dimensional, parallel universes, expanding universes. So many of the powerful models in physics now really have to rely on a faith in mathematics. Hey, Rupert, you're back.
I'm back. Yes, sorry about that.
No problem. Well, we were just talking about that issue of. I actually at that moment I was just talking about another thing that I came away with from your book, which I was first introduced to through reading the French neo-Thomist philosopher Jacques Maritain, which is to recognize how much of our physics, which is sort of like, you know, the top dog of the sciences, the one who gets to talk for science itself more than most others. There's reasons for that. We could talk about that, but that so much of contemporary physics, the string theory and these wild models and fabulous science fictional constructs that people come up with, so many of them have to do with a fundamental faith in mathematics, that the universe is essentially mathematical, which is itself kind of a faith or kind of an axiom. It's not really exactly clear where we can trust math and where we can say, well, that math doesn't apply to the physical reality. Well, in this sense, it does apply to physical reality. Can you talk a little bit about that the weird way that what we think of as quote-unquote physics, the science of the stuff that actually exists, is in a sneaky way a kind of science of mathematics?
Well, I think that I think it's true that that's the case. I think it goes back a long way, and in ancient Greece, when the philosophers were trying to find something that was constant behind the realm of change, their obsession was that reality must be eternal or changeless. Maybe they got that idea from mystical experiences, but different schools of Greek thought had different theories about what's eternal. And the Pythagorean school, following Pythagoras, thought that what was eternal was mathematics, because the truths of mathematics somehow seem timeless. They're outside space and time. The proportions and the ratios that are reflected in nature, these mathematical relationships, are somehow over and above the physical world. Now, Plato was very influenced by Pythagoras, but he thought maths wasn't enough, that when you come to look at, say, the good, the true, and the beautiful, these are not mathematical concepts. When you think about an oak tree or a horse, these are not obviously mathematical concepts either. So he thought that there was a larger realm outside space and time, the Platonic ideas or forms that included mathematics, but also many other eternal archetypes of what's in nature. The materialists, the atomists in the 5th century BC, had the idea that what's permanent is matter made up of lots of little bits, the atoms that don't change. So these were all different schools of thought about eternity. And in the 17th century, when modern science got going, the scientific revolution, they came up with a combination of these two theories. Nature's made up of bits of matter which stay the same once they've come into being in the first place. They thought they came into being through God, creating them all, and the Big Bang theory says they all came into being, at least sequentially, but all the matter and energy basically came into being with the Big Bang. But in the 17th century, they thought that what they were discovering through physics, particularly Newtonian physics, which was the most impressive structure in science at the time, was the eternal laws of nature. The very mind of God was being revealed to scientists and mathematicians, because God, they thought, was a mathematician. And that gave science a huge prestige. They were discovering eternal divine truths about nature. Nowadays, of course, we think of scientific theories as provisional models that can be tested by experiment, etc. They're man-made constructs. But deep in the heart of most theoretical physicists and mathematicians, and deep in the heart of our culture since the 17th century, has been this kind of secret, implicit Platonism or Pythagoreanism, that this is the ultimate truth. Somehow mathematics is the ultimate truth, and nature just somehow reflects mathematics. This has always been a much more attractive philosophy to mathematicians and theoretical physicists than it has to biologists, because you don't have the same kind of mathematical clarity in biology. You don't have a kind of simple formula for a camel or for a palm tree or for a porcupine. There's no obvious mathematical model for such things. But the idea that maths must be the ultimate reality has always appealed to mathematicians and to physicists, and it's always helped to reinforce them as the high priests of science, partly because most people don't understand maths, and partly because science has been extraordinarily successful in creating new technologies like the internet and the Hubble Space Telescope and television and smartphones and so on. And so people think, well, that means maths must be true and all this must be true.
Yeah, well,
so
one
I
of
think
the
it's
things
given this extreme prestige.
Yeah, one of the things that I like about how you approach things is, and partly because you're so rooted in biology, is through a more both historical and evolutionary idea of these things, meaning that these ideas emerge in time, they emerge in histories, and we have to be aware of how they interact with politics, with social power, and that kind of thinking. But you also have a more evolutionary notion of these quote-unquote laws themselves. Again, one of the things that has stayed with me these many decades since I first read New Science of Life is this just basic idea to play with, like, what if these things that we think of as laws are habits? That's a powerful, powerful idea, and you mean it not just in a metaphorical sense, like laws associated with a lawgiver or some a potentate or authority, and a habit is something more generalized, etc. But it really gets down to this fundamental kind of hidden Platonism that's in physics, that's in mathematics in particular. This idea that, like, even these basic quote unquote laws in the universe are not so much laws as very ingrained habits. Can you talk a little bit about what happens when you shift away from just using the concept of law towards thinking in terms of something that the universe has learned to do over time and continues to repeat because there's sort of a sort of basin of attraction to do it that way rather than some kind of abstract law?
Well, it gives a very different sense of nature, because if you have the idea of laws imposed on nature, it's basically dualistic. The laws are out there beyond space and time, or they all sprang into being at the moment of the Big Bang for no known reason, and somehow not influenced by anything that actually happens. that is this kind of Platonic thing which has this dualism between the realm of forms or ideas beyond space and time and the material world in space and time. With the idea of habit in an evolutionary universe, then it's not dualistic in the same way. It's the habits build up in nature depending on what's happened before. Evolution and natural selection play a part at all levels of nature. Unsuccessful habits in physics or chemistry don't get repeated. Successful ones do, and they become increasingly habitual through repetition. So there's a kind of natural selection going on at all levels of nature, and it gives us a much more organic sense of nature. I think that the evolutionary cosmology with the Big Bang is implicitly an organic view of nature. It's like the hatching of the cosmic egg, a universe hatching and then growing and expanding and forming new structures within it. It's much more like a gigantic embryo than like a machine, which was the 17th century model. So I think the idea of habit fits the evolutionary worldview very much better. Interestingly, the American philosopher C.S. Peirce, P-E-I-R-C-E, as you know, it's a strange spelling, but he had this idea around 1900 that he thought the universe was an evolving universe. He was years ahead of his time, and that such a universe would be governed by habits rather than laws. It's interesting, too, that the contemporary cosmologist Lee Smolin has recently come up with a very similar idea. He calls it the principle of precedence, that once something's happened, it's more likely to happen again. He doesn't propose a mechanism for it, but it's obviously very similar to the idea of morphic resonance. So I think that why this is a more attractive idea is that it fits much better with an evolutionary universe. It fits much better with a kind of organic universe with a memory immanent within it, rather than a transcendent set of laws outside the universe, this rather dualistic model that we're more used to. It also highlights the question of creativity, because as the universe evolves, new things have to come into being. Habits only repeat what's happened before. You can have permutations and combinations of them that are new, but the habits themselves must have started with creative acts. And this gives us a vision of the universe which is an interplay between habit and creativity. There have to be creative acts. There has to be some creative principle or principles at work throughout nature, right from the beginning, right up until now, and into the future. There's lots of creativity. Not all the creativity works very well. That which does is repeated and turns into a habit. You know, it's like in the human realm. Every year there's hundreds of new patents put forward and filed with the patent office. There's hundreds of new tunes and millions of new books and inventions and all sorts of things. Most of them don't make it. You never hear of them again. The ones that do become successful products or successful parts of our culture. And I think the same is true all through evolution. I think there's a tremendous creativity at all levels of nature. And then there's a filtering process through a kind of natural selection, and then a repetition of what works through habit. And then on the basis of that, more habits can grow up, new creativity can occur, and so on as the universe evolves.
Wonderful. Well, one of our habits here on Expanding Mind is to take a break halfway through the show, so we're going to do that right now. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis. We're talking with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, and we'll be right back after this.
Hi, this is Tony Hendra
and Jeff Chrysler
of the Final Edition Radio Hour
on PRN,
your source for organic,
gluten-free,
sustainable satire.
Hi, am Sandy Leon Best, host of Political Analysis. Welcome to the 21st century, where the corporate propaganda machine works 24/7 to manufacture your reality. Every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Political Analysis challenges the corporate narrative with independent news, analysis, and passionate conversations on the most critical issues of our time. Don't let the corporate echo machine become your truth. Tune in live to Political Analysis or visit the archives at prn.fm. If you like the show, rate us in iTunes. The Progressive Radio Network is moving forward, and we hope you are coming with us.
Welcome. I'm Catherine, host of Heart of Mind Radio, broadcasting over prn.fm on Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Join me and explore your inner world, your divine self, and your sacred path. Listen and be inspired by authors, healers, shamans, scientists, mystics, and you. Yes, your calls are most important of all. You can listen to Heart of Mind Radio on the archives anytime, 24/7. And please don't forget, rate the show on iTunes. I bring my 30 years experience as a teacher, spiritual doula, and vibrational healer. That's Fridays at 10 a.m.
You are listening to PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome back. Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. We're talking with Rupert Sheldrake about the science delusion and morphic resonance. Going in a somewhat different direction, Rupert, at the end of your book, you talk about a kind of vision of a different vision of science and how science might be carried out in society today. And one of the things you talk about there is citizen science, how people can inform themselves, become, develop their own ways of representing their interests, interact with scientists, and come up with other ways of doing science alongside the existing institutions, which, as those announcements kind of alluded to, are in so many ways under various corporate business interests, and which also have these ingrained attitudes, particularly around atheism and a certain kind of skepticism. And you yourself have played with these problems in the sense that you are interested in studying some topics that are definitely outside of the realm of conventional science in terms of what people believe. They're heretical for many, and these have to do with what we could call the paranormal or psi phenomenon. The sense of being stared at is one that you have done a lot of work on and wrote a book about. And so in doing these projects, though, there's the opportunity, especially now with the internet and the kind of enthusiasm for doing experiments, for maker culture, for democratizing scientific practices. There's a lot of room now, probably, for new ways of doing this kind of research. So I just love to hear you talk a little bit about how your own needs to do research in these more heretical fields has changed your idea of how science might be done in the world today.
Yes, well, it has changed my idea, because as soon as I started developing ideas that were outside the standard consensus mainstream view, I found, of course, that it was hard to get funding, it was hard to get lab space, if not impossible. That the present system is highly conservative, and it's basically designed for incremental improvements in existing fields of knowledge, rather than radical breakthroughs or revolutionary changes. So I think science has got stuck, both ideologically and through its organization. That's why my book, The Science Delusion, which is what it's called in Britain, is called in America Science Set Free, which is actually, I think, a better title for it. It more expresses what I'm trying to do. Now, I wrote a book called 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. It first came out in 1994. And that was an attempt to find radical paradigm-breaking experiments that could be done on budgets of $10 or less. I was working on the principle that you won't get grants for radical research. So then I wanted to find ways of doing research that could be done almost for nothing. That's why the book is subtitled A Do-It-Yourself Guide to Revolutionary Science. Several of the ideas I put forward there I've followed up myself, and many others have as well. And one of the experiments in that book was on the sense of being stared at, and that led to a whole series of experiments and a whole new book with that title. Another one was on unexplained powers of animals, and that was followed up in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. What this made me realize is that a lot of science can still be done on extremely small budgets. Not only was it an idea that I put forward in that book, it's turned out to be a reality, because much of the research I've been doing since then has been very, very low budget research involving large-scale public participation. For example, I have an experiment running right now, and as we speak, people are probably doing it, on telephone telepathy. And this works on cell phones or on landlines. The test requires 3 people to do it. It takes about 15 minutes. And it's an objective, statistical, scientific test to see whether telepathy actually happens in connection with phone calls. Most people think it does because they've had the experience of thinking of someone for no apparent reason who then calls, and they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." Most people have had that experience. They don't think it's weird. They think it's normal because it's happened to them and to their friends. Many people who keep dogs or cats have had the experience of finding their animals anticipate when a member of the family is coming home. They go and wait at a door or a window, sometimes 10 minutes, even half an hour beforehand, long before they could hear a car or footsteps in the street. And the sense of being stared at, the great majority of people, including children, have experienced being looked at from behind, turning around and seeing someone looking at them, or looking at others from behind and making them turn. So these are what I call the mysteries of everyday life, and none of them fit into the standard mechanistic, materialist, scientific worldview. All of them are dismissed by so-called skeptics as being impossible or illusory or make-believe or superstition. And yet, experiments to test them are extremely cheap. Anyone can do them. And the results so far suggest these phenomena are indeed very real, that our minds are not confined to the insides of our heads, but extend far beyond them, and our thoughts and intentions can have an effect on other people and on animals at a distance. So this is one way in which I'm trying to put into practice the idea of more participatory science, and so far successfully, because luckily a lot of people are interested in these tests and take part in them.
And one of the things that's cool about these topics, particularly the sense of being stared at, is that if this is a real phenomenon, and I count myself as someone who, as the critics would say, anecdotally have had these experiences, as well as telephone telepathy, particularly with my wife. We call it spousal ESP. And it's happened far too many times for me to believe it's simply because I'm noticing the times it does happen and not paying attention to the times that it doesn't happen when I'm thinking about her or getting a call from her. But that's just quote-unquote anecdotal. But if we think about this question of the sense of being stared at, it actually goes around to a topic in the earlier part of the podcast when we were talking about fields. I think one of the favorite sections of the science delusion, or a science set free, is this question about whether minds are confined to brains. And there you're really talking about this field of vision, and it's clear that your theoretical explorations there are partly in relationship to this sense of being stared at. How would the world be such that the sense of being stared at is a real phenomenon? And this whole notion of vision as being itself a place where we we internalize different ideas about how the world works. I mean, it's so common to have the conversation with people that takes the following form. Well, you know that all this world that you're looking at with tables and chairs and trees and there's colors, it doesn't really exist. It doesn't really exist. That's just your brain interpreting, radiation frequencies and turning things into color. Or it's a model that's running on the inside of your skull the same way that we dream when we're inside of our waking life. Our minds are creating dream models that are constrained by sensory input, but what we're seeing is actually a model in the brain. It has nothing to do with what's actually out there. And this always seemed to be such a strange kind of move, not because I couldn't imagine that it was the case. I can imagine it. I've watched enough science fiction to think that maybe we're brains in vats or something like that, or in some virtual game display. But it's more the way that it sort of comes up in conversation, and people go, "Oh yeah, sure, that's yeah, of course that's the way it is." But it's so counterintuitive that you must place an enormous amount of faith and trust in those authorities who are saying that it's actually all just in your skull. There's no real world out there. But as you point out, if the phenomena the sense of being stared at refers to something real, that perhaps our whole model of vision is off, and that what we're seeing when we see is some combination of things that are happening inside of our brains and are extruded a presence in a real world where real other things are going on. Can you talk a little bit more about that sense or a vision as a place where we kind of internalize some of the materialist dogmas, even though in a way like the counter evidence is right before our eyes?
Yes. Well, this is one of the most peculiar features of materialistic science, this idea that all our vision, everything we're seeing, is actually inside our head. When we look at the sky or the stars in the sky, our skull is beyond the sky. Everything we're experiencing is inside our head. The skull that we seem to have is just a virtual skull that's a construction inside this larger world that is all internal. Now, that completely goes against our most immediate experience and the experience of everybody else in the world. And most of human history, people have not thought of vision like that. Plato and Euclid, for example, in ancient Greece, thought that vision involved not just light coming in, but a projection of images outwards. In fact, Euclid was the person who first adequately explained mirrors and how they work. The light is reflected by the mirror and comes into our eye, but when we project out our vision, what we're projecting out is in our minds and not blocked by glass. It goes straight through the glass of the mirror surface. And so we project out the image to behind the mirror. The virtual images we see every time we look in a mirror are evidence, immediate evidence for the projective power of our vision. Well, I think that this is a very persuasive way of looking at it, and so I don't claim any originality for the idea that our visual world is projected out to where it seems to be. It's a construction of our minds. It's affected by what happens in our brains. It depends on the light that comes into our eyes and the wavelengths of that light. But this construction is, I think, projected to where it seems to be, except when we're having hallucinations or illusions. Now, the official view is not that different. The official view is that light comes into the eyes, changes happen in the optic nerves, the retina and the optic nerves, changes then happen in the brain. And we construct a three-dimensional virtual reality display inside our head with it's got three dimensions, it's got space, it's got colors. All that's somehow mysteriously contained to the inside of our skull, even though it's virtual, it's a virtual reality. Well, first of all, if it's virtual and virtual reality, which is what a lot of cognitive scientists think, then why should it be blocked by the skull, as if it's something physical? And secondly, if it's really inside the brain, then when you look in people's brains during operations, why don't you see a virtual reality display? So the current view is not as if it's actually totally persuasive or has convincing evidence in its favor. It doesn't have any evidence in its favor. And yet our whole civilization's been sort of hypnotized by this theory, which goes directly against our most immediate experience. I find it a very strange thing that this idea, it's all inside the head, is so much part of people's everyday conversation, as you were saying. And I think it's partly a way of people proving that they're educated. Uneducated people don't think that it's all inside their head, and neither do children. The developmental psychologist Jean Piaget showed that until the age of about 10 or 11, the average Western child thinks that that vision involves a projection out of images, and that's why in Roald Dahl's story Matilda, the idea of eye beams that she projects out, it appeals very much to children. So does the idea in Superman comics of rays going out of Superman's eyes. Children think like that, but all of us are grown-ups, and we know that primitive people believe that vision involves an outward projection of images. We know that children think it that way, so we want to prove we're smart. We at least pretend that we believe it's all inside the head. I don't think in actual moment-to-moment life people are really thinking that everything they're seeing is inside their head. I think they're thinking that what they're seeing is just where it seems to be, and I think they're right. Although people would pay intellectual assent to this theory, in practice they lead their lives as if the images of their mental experience is actually outside their head where it seems to be.
Well, that's such an important distinction, and you talk about in the book too, is just the way in which, whether professionally or in terms of our social life, there's this sort of split that many people have between the official worldview that they acknowledge verbally and as kind of they give intellectual assent to, and then the place where they actually live. It's always struck me the kind of cognitive dissonance that some very determinist neuroscientists who believe that everything that we think is just an after image of some physical event that is essentially determined, how they reconcile that with their experience of being agents who fall in love and make decisions and have to make moral calls and all of that, that at the very least, if you have those kinds of intellectual positions, you have to have a very robust way of explaining how you cordon off a different world where you actually live. But if you talk to these people, for the most part, they have no explanation. There's no bridge. And that itself indicates how much we have sort of given over our authority as an attempt to gain authority in a social world or a scientific world or an intellectual world that's so dominated by these concepts. Do you think that's changing?
I think it is partly, but it is a very interesting thing that this process that you described goes on. And one of the things that skeptics or so-called skeptics like to do is to show how unreliable our judgment is. If they say, well, if they're criticizing some anecdotal evidence for parapsychology, for example, they'd say, oh, well, we make false judgments. We often, don't estimate frequencies as statistical frequencies properly. We're easily deceived. We have selective attention. We have blind spots with lots of things we don't notice, inattentional blindness, and all that kind of thing. They love going on about that, and it's true. Our judgments are faulty. But if you accept that our judgments are faulty, which is what all that shows to prove, that we can't totally rely on our own impressions, then what are we to rely on? And the answer is the authority of science. And so all of that stuff to try and downgrade our own experience is meant to upgrade the authority of science. But I think that's coming unraveled in a rather interesting way at the moment, because there's been this big crisis in science in the last few years, the so-called replicability crisis. It turns out that most scientific studies in most fields are not replicable. A great deal of the so-called objectivity of science is a house of cards. So I think that's one thing that even scientists are beginning to see, that the idea it's all firm, totally well established, one thing's true and the other lot's just subjective opinion. That sharp division is breaking down. I think it's also the case that many people are coming to recognize that this scientific view of consciousness as being nothing but the brain is too limited. And this is partly because of the advance of consciousness studies, which is now a respectable part of science. And until recently, there was no scientific study of things like near-death experiences, meditation, hallucinations, psychedelic experiences, and so forth. A whole range of conscious experiences which were ignored in the era when behaviorism dominated psychology and dismissed all subjective experience as illusory. Now, when we take these things seriously, we realize just how wonderful and amazing our minds are. And the only way of finding out about conscious experience is through conscious experience. I think this is something of a revolution. The thing that strikes me most about this extremely rigid division between a literally incredible materialist view of our own nature, which says we have no free will, no consciousness is a kind of illusion, everything we experience is inside our brain, and so on, and our real experience of life. This is, I think, maintained only during working hours, even by quite committed materialists. As soon as they go home in the evening, they're with their spouses, their children, their pets, their gardens, and so forth. They behave like normal people. They assume they have free will. They assume that all these experiences are real. And I've found that even when it comes to things like psychic phenomena, telephone telepathy, the sense of being stared at, psychic pets, most of my scientific colleagues who, if you speak to them at work, appear to be completely conventional and materialistic, if you talk to them in the evening after a few glasses of wine, it turns out, yes, of course, they have telepathic telephone experiences. They've had the sense of being stared at. Some of them have dogs that know when they're coming home from the laboratory, and so on. What I think really will help things is when people come out about these experiences instead of pretending they don't have them, because they're extremely common. And I think this will change scientific discourse within the professional scientific community and within the academic world.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have to wrap up here, but just to finalize that thought, I think that you used the phrase "coming out," and I think that gesture, which we first saw with people around their sexual preferences, the notion like I actually am one of these people, or even just the encouragement to share the full domain of one's experiences in these contexts, is a really powerful move. It's honest. It's direct. It doesn't even require that you say this means you believe in animal telepathy. It's simply the introduction of these positions. I think it's a very healthy thing, and I just want to thank you for spending such a long time fighting so many nasty skeptics and being so graceful about standing up for this stuff and making room for it in a way that respects both science and the openness of our experience in the evolving cosmos. So thank you, Rupert.
Well, thank you, Erik.
And thanks for being on Expanding Minds. So we'll wrap it up there, folks. Keep your minds open.